Station Omega-7 hung in the void like a particularly pretentious piece of abstract art, all flowing curves and unnecessary spires that screamed, "Look how advanced we are," to anyone unfortunate enough to dock there. The Galactic Military Assessment Facility, as it was so grandly titled, served one primary function: determining whether newly discovered species possessed the combat prowess necessary to join the greater galactic community as anything more than tribute-paying footnotes in history. The facility's corridors hummed with the self-important bustle of bureaucrats who genuinely believed that standardized testing could measure the soul of a species. Today's agenda featured what the scheduling department had cheerfully classified as a routine evaluation of something called humanity, a designation that had already inspired several committee members to place bets on how quickly this assessment would conclude. In Assessment Chamber 7 Alpha, a collection of the galaxy's finest military minds had gathered to witness what they fully expected to be another tedious afternoon of disappointment. The chamber itself was a monument to intimidation, gleaming metal walls adorned with holographic displays showing the combat achievements of 1,000 successful species, all designed to remind candidates exactly how insignificant they were in the grand scheme of galactic warfare. Sergeant Voxtar of the Drakari Empire lounged in his observation throne with the casual arrogance of someone who had presided over exactly 43 of these evaluations. His species had earned their place in the galactic hierarchy through sheer brutality, a fact he never tired of mentioning at dinner parties. The Drakari measured approximately 8 feet in height when fully extended, possessed 4 arms ending in razor-sharp claws, and had evolved from apex predators who viewed everything smaller than themselves as either prey or entertainment. "Another mammalian species from the Outer Rim," he announced to his fellow assessors, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Third planet from a yellow star, still burning fossil fuels for energy. They've managed to split the atom but haven't figured out faster-than-light travel on their own." He paused to let this damning evidence sink in. The preliminary reports suggest they spend more time fighting amongst themselves than exploring their own star system. The other committee members, a mixture of crystalline Zephyrians, mechanical Forgeborn, and gas-based ethereals, hummed their agreement in frequencies that would have shattered human eardrums. This was, after all, the natural order of things. Species either evolved into galactic predators, or remained planetary curiosities, forever bound to their homeworlds and relegated to mining contracts. "What combat paradigm are they requesting assessment for?" inquired Assessment Director Blixara, her multiple eyes already reviewing the next candidate on her schedule. The Zephyrians prided themselves on efficiency above all else, and she had 3 more species to evaluate before the station's dinner cycle. "Ground Combat Specialist," Voxtar replied, his mandibles clicking in what passed for laughter among his kind. "They've sent a single representative. Standard protocol suggests we demonstrate the futility of their request through practical application." The chamber's main viewport irised open to reveal the testing arena below, a circular platform surrounded by energy barriers and monitoring equipment that could measure everything from reflexive response time to the precise moment when hope died in a candidate's eye. It was here that countless species had learned the harsh reality of galactic power structures, usually within the first 30 seconds of engagement. Standing in the center of this technological coliseum was the human representative, and she was measuring roughly 5.5 feet in height. She possessed the standard mammalian bipedal configuration with only 2 arms, no visible natural weapons, and what appeared to be an almost criminal lack of protective evolutionary adaptation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple configuration that suggested either supreme confidence or complete ignorance of what was about to occur. Most remarkably, she appeared to be half asleep. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, her posture relaxed to the point of casualness, and she surveyed the chamber with the sort of mild interest typically reserved for moderately entertaining museum exhibits. When the arena's announcement system activated to inform her that combat evaluation would commence shortly, she simply nodded and stretched her arms above her head like someone preparing for light exercise. "Fascinating," muttered Dr. Hexivan, the facility's xenobiology specialist. "Either their species has developed an extraordinary capacity for meditation under stress, or their survival instincts have been completely bred out of them through centuries of protected civilization." "The latter seems more likely," Voxtar observed, already selecting his champion for the demonstration. Their preliminary data suggests they've never encountered a truly hostile alien species. Their concept of warfare is limited to conflicts with their own kind, using primitive projectile weapons and chemical explosives. The irony was lost on none of them. Well, it would have been if any of them had possessed the self-awareness necessary to recognize irony. Here sat representatives of species who had conquered their galaxies through superior firepower, advanced technology and evolutionary advantages, preparing to demonstrate their dominance over a species that had never faced anything more dangerous than itself. The facility's combat roster displayed on the central screen, showcasing available warriors from across the galactic community. Each entry included detailed combat statistics, victory records, and threat assessments that read like particularly violent poetry. Voxtar's claw hovered over the selections with the deliberate care of someone choosing the perfect wine to accompany dinner. Standard protocol suggests a mid-tier combatant for preliminary assessment, Director Blixara noted, though her tones suggested she was already mentally filing the paperwork for humanity's inevitable rejection. Indeed, Voxtar agreed, though his claw had already moved past the mid-tier selections toward something far more impressive. However, I believe a more definitive demonstration would serve the galaxy's interests better. No sense in wasting time with multiple assessments when we can establish their limitations immediately. Below in the arena, the human continued her bizarre pre-combat ritual of appearing utterly unconcerned by her circumstance. She had removed a small container from her pocket and was now consuming what the facility's sensors identified as a mild stimulant dissolved in heated water. Apparently their species' approach to combat preparation involved caffeine consumption rather than the traditional meditation, weapon consecration or intimidation displays favored by successful warrior cultures. The committee watched with the sort of morbid fascination typically reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular training accidents. This was going to be educational in the way that cautionary tales usually were. A perfect example of what happened when evolution failed to prepare a species for the broader universe's realities. Warrior Prime Gyth'los began his ritual combat assessment with the methodical precision that had made the Vorthak hegemony synonymous with military excellence across 17 star systems. His species had evolved on a death world where survival required constant vigilance, lightning reflexes, and the ability to kill anything that moved before it could return the favor. They had subsequently refined these natural gifts into an art form that impressed even the galaxy's most jaded military observers. The preliminary display was poetry written in controlled violence. His retractable blade limbs extended with mechanical precision, each one capable of independent movement and deadly accuracy. The facility's sensors detected microscopic adjustments in his stance as his internal combat systems analyzed the arena's dimensions, atmospheric density, gravitational constants, and potential tactical advantage. His natural armor plates shifted subtly, optimizing protection while maintaining maximum mobility. Magnificent, breathed Assessment Coordinator Thrixinal, his gaseous form shimmering with appreciation. Notice how he's calculating force vectors for 17 different attack patterns. Simultaneously, the Vorthak neural architecture truly represents evolution's finest military achievement. Director Blixara's multiple eyes tracked the warrior's movements with professional admiration. Warrior Prime Gyth'los holds the facility record for fastest combat resolution, 4.7 seconds against a crystalline berserker that had previously been considered undefeatable. And that, Sergeant Voxtar added with considerable satisfaction, was against an opponent that actually possessed defensive capabilities. The comparison hung in the air like a particularly damning verdict. The crystalline berserkers were living gemstone constructs, whose bodies could deflect energy weapons, and whose strength allowed them to punch through starship hulls. They were by any reasonable measure exponentially more dangerous than a bipedal mammal, whose most impressive evolutionary achievement appeared to be opposable thumb. Gyth'los completed his combat assessment and turned his attention to the human candidate with what might generously be called professional interest. She remained exactly where she had been standing, relaxed, alert without appearing tense, and displaying no visible reaction to the display of lethal capability she had just witnessed. Most opponents, even experienced warriors, showed some physiological response to his pre-combat ritual. Elevated heart rates, defensive posturing, weapon preparation, or at minimum some acknowledgement that they were about to engage in potentially fatal combat. The human simply watched him with those half-lidded eyes that suggested she might be contemplating a particularly pleasant afternoon nap. Dr. Hexvin's instruments were registering readings that defied conventional xenobiology. Her neurochemistry remains completely stable, he reported, though his voice carried a note of confusion that hadn't been there minutes earlier. No adrenaline spike, no cortisol elevation, no activation of fight or flight responses. Either her species has developed unprecedented emotional control, or she genuinely doesn't understand what's about to happen. The latter seems more probable, Voxtar replied, though he found himself studying the human's biometric displays with increasing attention. Primitive species often lack the cognitive framework necessary to process genuine threat. In the arena, Gyth'los had begun his final pre-engagement sequence. The Vorthak approach to combat emphasized overwhelming initial assault, strike fast, strike hard, and end the conflict before the opponent could mount any meaningful resistance. His blade limbs moved through a brief warm-up routine that would have been hypnotically beautiful, if it weren't so obviously lethal. The human responded to this display by removing a small elastic band from her wrist, and using it to secure her hair more tight. It was such a mundane practical gesture that several committee members found themselves momentarily stunned by its casual normalcy. Here was a being preparing for combat against a galactic apex predator, and her primary concern appeared to be ensuring her hair wouldn't obstruct her vision. Fascinating adaptation, Dr. Hexvin murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was referring to. She's treating this as a routine physical activity rather than a life-threatening encounter. Ignorance, Voxtar stated flatly, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his colleagues. Complete and total ignorance of the situation's gravity. The arena's final combat preparations activated automatically. Energy barriers reached maximum containment strength. Medical emergency systems went to standby alert, and the facility's recording equipment began capturing data that would later be filed under routine species rejection, combat inadequate. The whole process had been streamlined over centuries of similar evaluations, refined to bureaucratic perfection. Gyth'los assumed his attack position, a deceptively relaxed stance that could explode into lethal motion in microseconds. His internal combat computers had finished their analysis, and identified 43 distinct attack vectors that would end the engagement within 5 seconds. The human's lack of visible weapons, armor, or defensive positioning had simplified the tactical equation considerably. The observation chamber fell silent, except for the gentle hum of monitoring equipment. This was the moment that defined species, when theory met reality, and comfortable assumptions either proved correct or shattered against uncomfortable truth. Every committee member had witnessed this moment dozens of times, and the outcome was as predictable as stellar mechanics. Warrior Prime Gyth'los, Sergeant Voxtar's voice carried the weight of galactic authority. Demonstrate standard engagement protocol. Show this candidate what real combat looks like. The command echoed through the arena with finality that seemed to settle the matter before it began. Standard engagement protocols were exactly what they sounded like: efficient, overwhelming, and designed to establish dominance so completely that further resistance became psychologically impossible. Gyth'los acknowledged the order with a subtle shift in posture that every experienced warrior in the observation chamber recognized. He was no longer warming up or assessing. He was committed to action. His blade limbs locked into optimal striking configuration. His weight distribution shifted to explosive attack stance, and his internal combat systems began their final targeting sequence. The human made no corresponding preparation. She remained standing in the center of the arena with her hands at her sides, her breathing steady and controlled, and her half-lidded eyes fixed on her approaching opponent, with what appeared to be mild curiosity rather than combat readiness. 10 credits says it's over in 3 seconds. Assessment Coordinator Thrixnell whispered to his colleagues. 2 seconds, Director Blexera countered. She's not even attempting to defend herself. Hexvin refrained from betting, though his instruments were recording biometric data that he was already planning to include in his next xenobiology research publication. The complete absence of stress response in a mammalian species facing imminent death would represent a significant contribution to the scientific literature,
assuming there was enough of the human left afterward for proper tissue analysis. Gyth'los began his attack sequence with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among his people. 4 blade limbs moved in perfect coordination, each following a trajectory calculated to disable rather than immediately kill the Vorthok, understanding of mercy in action. His movements were too fast for most species to track visually, a blur of controlled lethality that represented the pinnacle of evolutionary combat adaptation. The human watched him approach with those same half-lidded eyes, and just before the moment of contact, something changed. Not in her posture, which remained relaxed, not in her expression, which maintained its air of casual interest, but something shifted in the quality of her attention, as if she had been observing the situation from a comfortable distance, and had suddenly decided to participate. Her right hand moved. The movement was so small, so economical, that several observers initially missed it entirely. No dramatic gestures, no elaborate martial arts displays, no desperate scrambling for defensive position. Just a slight adjustment of her right hand from its position at her side, to a point roughly 18 inches in front of her torso. Gyth'los's primary blade limb, moving at velocities that should have made interception impossible, met her palm with a sound like metal striking immovable stone, and stopped.
The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for moments when the fundamental laws of physics decide to take an unscheduled coffee break. In the observation chamber, several committee members discovered that their species' equivalent of jaws could, in fact, drop considerably further than previously thought possible. Gyth'los stared at his primary blade limb, which remained perfectly motionless despite the fact that he was applying approximately 3,000 pounds of forward pressure. The human had caught it, not deflected, not blocked, not avoided, caught it between her thumb and forefinger as casually as someone might pluck a piece of lint from their clothing. Her expression hadn't changed. Her breathing remained steady. Most remarkably, her eyes were still half-lidded, as if stopping a supersonic blade strike was roughly as challenging as catching a gently tossed ball. Equipment malfunction, Dr. Hextem announced with the desperate certainty of someone whose worldview had just been introduced to a sledgehammer. The monitoring systems are clearly providing false readings. Run full diagnostics immediately, Director Blixkara ordered, though her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who already suspected that their equipment was functioning perfectly and reality had simply decided to become inconvenient. Sergeant Voxtar said nothing, which was perhaps the most telling response of all. His mandibles had ceased their characteristic clicking and his forearms hung motionless at his sides, while his brain attempted to process sensory input that violated several fundamental assumptions about how the universe was supposed to work. In the arena, Gyth'los was discovering that his centuries of combat training had not prepared him for this particular scenario. His internal combat computers were generating error messages with impressive creativity, unable to calculate appropriate responses to a situation where his primary attack had been neutralized by what appeared to be casual indifference. He attempted to withdraw his blade limb and found that the human's grip, while appearing gentle, was as immovable as a neutron star's gravity well. Interesting technique, the human commented, and her voice was the first sound anyone had made in nearly 30 seconds. It carried no strain, no effort, no indication that she was currently restraining a weapon capable of slicing through reinforced hull plating. Very fast. Good form too. Your balance recovery systems are quite sophisticated. She was, the committee realized with growing horror, providing constructive feedback on his attack methodology while simultaneously demonstrating its complete ineffectiveness. Gyth'los' remaining 3 blade limbs moved in perfectly coordinated strikes from different angles, a combination attack that had never failed to overwhelm even the most skilled opponent. The human's left hand intercepted 2 of them simultaneously, pinching them between her fingers like someone stopping a pair of argumentative children from poking each other. Her right elbow casually deflected the 4th blade with a movement so economical it barely qualified as a gesture. The multi-vector approach is clever, she observed, apparently oblivious to the fact that she had just negated an attack sequence that had taken Gyth'los 12 years to perfect. Though you might want to vary your timing a bit more. The synchronized strikes are impressive, but they're somewhat predictable once you recognize the pattern. Dr. Hextem's instruments were now registering readings that defied not only xenobiology but several branches of theoretical physics. The human's muscle tension remained at resting levels despite restraining forces that should have required her entire muscular system operating at maximum capacity. Her cellular activity showed no signs of the massive energy expenditure that should have been necessary for such displays of strength. "This is impossible," he whispered, though he was no longer sure which part of the situation he was referring to. Assessment Coordinator Thrixnell had shifted through several colors that didn't exist in standard galactic chromatic databases, his gaseous form flickering between states of matter as his consciousness struggled to process what he was witnessing. "Perhaps," he suggested weakly, "the human has been augmented with hidden technological enhancements." "Scan results negative," Dr. Hexton reported automatically, though his voice suggested he no longer trusted his own equipment. "No artificial implants, no technological augmentation, no external power sources. She's completely organic." In the arena, Gyth'los had progressed from confusion through disbelief and was now approaching something resembling panic. None of his attacks were working. None of his training applied. The fundamental principles of combat that had governed his entire existence were being casually discarded by a being who looked like she might have difficulty opening particularly stubborn packaging. He attempted to activate his emergency combat protocols, a biochemical surge that would triple his strength and quadruple his reflexes for short periods. The enhancement flooded his system with combat stimulants that should have allowed him to overpower virtually any opponent through sheer physical force. The human's grip didn't budge. "Oh, you have internal stimulant systems," she noted with what appeared to be genuine interest. "That's quite sophisticated. I can feel your strength increasing." She paused thoughtfully. "Though you might want to be careful with that. The biochemical surge approach can lead to some nasty crashes if you're not used to managing the metabolic debt." She was giving him health advice while simultaneously demonstrating that his species' ultimate combat enhancement was as effective as angry thoughts. "Status report." Sergeant Voxstar's voice cracked slightly as it echoed through the arena's communication system. Gyth'los attempted to respond and discovered that his vocal systems had temporarily forgotten how to function. He managed a strangled sound that conveyed approximately the same meaning as extended scream. The human looked up toward the observation chamber, with those half-lidded eyes that had now become the most terrifying sight any of the committee members had ever encountered. "I think he's having some difficulty processing the situation," she called out helpfully. "Would you like me to demonstrate some basic escape techniques? It might help with his training programs." The offer was delivered with such casual sincerity that it took several seconds for the implications to fully register. She wasn't just restraining Gyth'los, she was offering to teach him how to improve his combat abilities while doing so. "This is a standard military assessment," Director Blixara managed to say, though her words sounded hollow even to herself. "Please proceed with whatever it is you're doing." "Oh, this is an assessment?" The human's eyebrows rose slightly in what appeared to be mild surprise. "I thought this was just a friendly sparring match. You probably should have mentioned that earlier." The casual revelation that she had been treating the encounter as a training exercise rather than a formal evaluation hit the observation chamber like a collapsing star. If this was her idea of casual sparring, what would actual combat look like? Gyth'los made one final desperate attempt to break free, channeling every ounce of strength his evolutionary advantages had provided. His natural armor plating strained against the forces involved. His blade limbs vibrated with barely contained energy, and his internal combat systems pushed beyond their design parameters in a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of warrior dignity. The human yawned. It was a small yawn, barely noticeable, the sort of thing someone might do during a particularly boring lecture. But in the context of restraining a galactic apex predator's full-power escape attempt, it carried the impact of a supernova. "Sorry," she said, apparently noticing the stunned expressions in the observation chamber. "I had a long flight, and the time zone changes are always rough. Plus, your artificial gravity is set a bit lower than what I'm used to, so everything feels kind of..." The word gentle echoed through the arena like a death knell for every comfortable assumption the galactic community had ever made about the nature of evolutionary advantage, technological superiority, and their place in the universe's hierarchy. In the observation chamber, Sergeant Voxstar slowly reached for his emergency communication device with one trembling claw. The emergency communication device in Sergeant Voxstar's trembling claw buzzed with an incoming priority message from Galactic Command that could be summarized as "What in the name of all that's holy is happening at your facility?" Apparently, the biometric readings from Assessment Chamber 7 Alpha were being flagged by automated systems as either equipment failure or the discovery of a new fundamental force of nature. Neither explanation was particularly comforting. Perhaps Hex fun, suggested with the desperate optimism of someone whose entire understanding of xenobiology was crumbling in real time. We should request a recess to recalibrate our monitoring equipment. The humans still casually restraining all four of Gyth'los's blade limbs while the warrior himself had progressed from panic to something resembling catatonic disbelief, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Oh, are you having technical difficulties? I could wait if you need to run diagnostics." The casual offer to pause her demonstration of impossible physical capabilities so they could fix their presumably broken instruments was somehow more unsettling than everything that had preceded it. It suggested a level of patient consideration that implied she could maintain her current grip indefinitely without experiencing anything resembling fatigue. "The equipment appears to be functioning within normal parameters," Director Blexera reported, though her voice carried all the enthusiasm of someone announcing their own execution date. "Excellent," the human replied cheerfully. "So shall I continue with the assessment? I assume there are more evaluation criteria beyond basic restraint techniques." Assessment Coordinator Strixnell's gaseous form had settled into a color that roughly translated as existential crisis in his species' emotional spectrum. What would you consider an appropriate demonstration of your species' combat capabilities?" The human's expression shifted to one of polite consideration, as if she were being asked about her preferences for lunch arrangements rather than military demonstration. "Well, this gentleman here seems quite skilled at blade work, so perhaps some basic disarmament techniques. Though I should probably mention that human combat training emphasizes non-lethal resolution whenever possible." The casual reference to disarmament techniques while currently demonstrating that their most advanced warriors' weapons were essentially decorative caused several committee members to experience what their species as medical professionals would later classify as stress-induced cognitive overflow. "Non-lethal," Sergeant Voxstar managed to croak. "It's considered more sporting," she explained, apparently missing the implications of describing galactic military assessment as a sporting activity. "Plus, it provides better opportunities for learning and improve. Hard to develop your skills if your training partners keep getting permanently damaged." With movements that appeared almost apologetically gentle, the human began demonstrating what she had described as basic disarmament technique. Gyth'los' blade limbs were carefully repositioned through what could only be described as an educational sequence, each movement designed to show how leverage, timing, and precise application of force could neutralize weapons that had been specifically evolved for lethality. The demonstration was conducted with the patient thoroughness of a master craftsperson explaining their trade to interested apprentices. Each technique was performed slowly enough for the observers to follow, with verbal commentary explaining the principles involved, and suggestions for how the approaches could be countered by more experienced opponents. "The key thing to remember," she said while casually bending one of Gyth'los's supposedly unbreakable blade limbs into a configuration that his anatomy wasn't designed to accommodate, "is that every weapon system has inherent limitations. Once you understand those limitations, you can work with them rather than against them." Dr. Hexevan's final diagnostic results arrived with a cheerful chime that seemed obscenely inappropriate for the occasion. Every system was functioning perfectly. Every measurement was accurate. Every impossible reading was being recorded with meticulous precision by equipment that had no explanation for what it was documenting. "Assessment complete," the human asked politely, releasing Gyth'los' blade limbs and stepping back with the casual satisfaction of someone who had just finished a pleasant training session. The warrior collapsed immediately, not from injury but from the psychological impact of having every assumption about combat, evolution, and his place in the universe methodically deconstructed by someone who had treated the entire encounter as a mild form of exercise. "Complete," Director Blexera whispered, though she was no longer entirely sure what they had been assessing or what the results meant for galactic civilization. The human stretched again, rolled her shoulders to work out what she apparently considered the minor stiffness of restraining a galactic apex predator, and looked up at the observation chamber with those same half-lidded eyes that had become the stuff of future nightmares. "Should I fill out any paperwork or do you have everything you need?" In the stunned silence that followed, the only sound was the gentle hum of monitoring equipment dutifully recording the moment when the galaxy's comfortable assumptions about evolutionary hierarchy decided to retire permanently. Somewhere in the depths of Galactic Command's bureaucratic maze,
Automated systems were already updating humanity's threat assessment from harmless primitive species to requires immediate high-level diplomatic consultation with maximum priority classification. The irony, of course, was that the humans had sent their most diplomatic representative. Station Omega-7 continued its orbit with mechanical indifference, but within its walls the Galactic Military Assessment Facility had just learned that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries come wrapped in the most unassuming packages. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a sense of humor that runs toward the absolutely terrifying. The human gathered her small personal belongings, nodded politely to the observation chamber, and headed toward the exit with the unhurried pace of someone whose afternoon schedule had been pleasantly concluded. Behind her, Gyth'los remained on the arena floor, staring at his blade limbs and wondering if they had always been quite so obviously inadequate. The assessment was indeed complete. The implications, however, were just beginning.